9 minutes, 7 men, one vision that would reshape the American underworld forever. The room was thick with cigar smoke and suspicion. Spring 1931, somewhere in New York City, the exact location lost to history or deliberately obscured. 7 of the most powerful mob bosses in America sat around a table, each representing territories, operations, and armies of men who killed on command. They'd been summoned by Charles "Lucky" Luciano, a man barely in his 30s, a man who weeks earlier had orchestrated events that left 2 of the most powerful crime lords in the country dead. They came because refusing would have been suicide. They stayed because what Luciano proposed in those 9 minutes was something none of them had imagined possible. He didn't ask them to follow him. He asked them to build something that had never existed in the criminal world, a structure based on cooperation instead of domination, on rules instead of blood feuds, on long-term profit instead of short-term revenge. He asked them to stop acting like gangsters and start thinking like businessmen. And when he finished speaking, when the silence settled and the cigar smoke cleared, the men in that room made a choice that would echo through organized crime for the next century. They said yes, and the commission was born. But the real story was never only about that meeting. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand the war that preceded it. Between 1929 and 1931, New York's Italian underworld tore itself apart. The Castellammarese War claimed dozens of lives and threatened to destroy everything Prohibition-era gangsters had built. On one side was Joe, the boss, Mafia, controlling much of Manhattan's Italian operations. On the other was Salvatore Maranzano, believing in old ways, rigid hierarchies, power structures modeled on ancient Rome. Caught between them was a generation of young gangsters who saw both men as relics. Lucky Luciano was one of those young gangsters, and he was done watching the old men destroy the future. Luciano had grown up on the Lower East Side, where immigrant kids learned quickly that survival meant building alliances across the ethnic boundaries their parents insisted on maintaining. While working for Mafia, he'd formed partnerships with Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel. He'd done business with Irish bootleggers and Italian crews from other families. He'd seen that the real money in Prohibition wasn't in fighting over territory, it was in organizing distribution, in creating systems, in treating crime like the corporate enterprise it was becoming. But Mafia and Maranzano couldn't see that. They were too busy trying to kill each other over respect and tradition, concepts that didn't pay bills or build empires. And that was when Luciano decided to end the war himself. What happened next changed the meaning of everything that came before. April 15, 1931. Joe Mafia was having lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a Coney Island restaurant he considered safe territory. Luciano was with him along with several other associates. After the meal, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. While he was gone, 4 men walked into the restaurant and opened fire. 20 shots. Mafia died at the table, cards still in his hand, the king of an empire that died with him. The gunmen walked out. Luciano emerged from the restroom, called the police, and expressed shock at the tragedy. No one believed his story. Everyone understood the message. The old boss was dead. A new order was beginning. But Luciano wasn't done yet, because removing Mafia only solved half the problem. Salvatore Maranzano declared victory. He called a meeting of all the Italian gangsters in New York and announced a new structure. He would be boss of bosses, the supreme authority. Beneath him would be families organized like Roman legions, each with clearly defined ranks and territories. It was the old Sicilian model imported wholesale to America, rigid and hierarchical in everything Luciano had been working to dismantle. Maranzano even had Luciano marked for death, seeing the young gangster as too independent, too ambitious, too dangerous to the traditional order. Maranzano believed he'd won the war, he'd killed his rival, restructured the underworld, and secured his position as the undisputed boss. He was wrong. 5 months later, on September 10, 1931, men dressed as police officers walked into Maranzano's office in the Grand Central Building and stabbed and shot him to death. The man who declared himself boss of bosses died in his own office, surrounded by the trappings of power that couldn't protect him. And when the violence stopped, when the bodies were counted and the smoke cleared, Lucky Luciano stood in the vacuum those deaths had created with a vision no one had seen coming. It looked like a power grab. It felt like something more revolutionary. Luciano could have declared himself the new boss of bosses. He'd orchestrated the deaths of both Masseria and Maranzano. He had the respect, the fear, and the strategic alliances to claim absolute authority. Every precedent in the Italian underworld suggested that's what came next. One supreme boss ruling through force and intimidation until someone killed him and took his place. An endless cycle of violence and succession that kept the criminal world unstable and unprofitable. Instead, Luciano called the meeting, 7 bosses, 1 room, and a proposal that broke with centuries of Sicilian tradition. He told them there would be no boss of bosses, no supreme authority. No one man with life and death power over everyone else. Instead, there would be a commission, a board of directors for organized crime. Each family would maintain autonomy over its own operations and territory. Major decisions affecting everyone, rules about drug dealing, conflicts between families, relationships with politicians and police would be brought to the commission and decided by vote. Disputes would be settled through negotiation, not war. Business would be conducted through structure, not chaos. It was heresy, it was brilliant, and it was the only way forward that didn't end in mutually assured destruction. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. Imagine being in that room. You're a boss who built your power through violence and intimidation. You've spent years, maybe decades, fighting for territory and respect. You've killed men who disrespected you. You've earned your position through blood, and now this young gangster, this upstart who's barely 35 years old, is telling you to share power, to follow rules you didn't write, to submit disputes to a committee vote instead of settling them with guns. Every instinct screams no, every tradition demands you reject this insult to your authority, but you're also smart enough to recognize the alternative. The Castellammarese War had nearly destroyed everyone. Masseria and Maranzano were both dead, along with dozens of soldiers, and for what? Territory that could have been shared, respect that could have been negotiated, pride that killed more men than bullets. Luciano was offering a way out of the cycle, a structure that would make everyone richer and keep everyone alive longer. The question wasn't whether you liked it. The question was whether you were smart enough to see the logic beneath your wounded pride. One by one, the bosses in that room made their calculation, and one by one they agreed, but there was something no one around him could fully understand. The commission wasn't just about preventing wars, it was about transforming the fundamental nature of organized crime in America. Under the old system, crime families were constantly at each other's throats. Territory disputes erupted into violence. Ethnic tensions fueled endless feuds. Power was temporary, held only until someone stronger came along. There was no long-term planning because there was no guarantee you'd live long enough to see long-term plans pay off. The commission changed that. By creating a forum for dispute resolution, it reduced violence. By establishing territories and rules, it created stability. By making bosses accountable to each other, it introduced a form of checks and balances that prevented any one family from becoming too powerful and destabilizing the whole system. It was, in its own criminal way, a democratic innovation, a constitutional convention for the underworld. And the genius of it was that it worked. The 5 families emerged: Luciano's own family, later led by Costello and Genovese; the Mangano family, later Gambino; Prophesai, later Colombo; Gagliano, later Lucchese; and Bonanno, each with defined territories, each with representation on the commission, each bound by the same rules. Beyond New York, the model spread. Chicago's outfit got a seat, Philadelphia, Buffalo. For the first time, there was coordination across territories, cooperation across ethnic lines, and a framework that allowed organized crime to function like a corporation rather than tribal warfare. The impact was immediate. Violence between families dropped. Bootlegging became more efficient and profitable. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the families diversified into gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, using the same cooperative model. The commission approved major moves, mediated disputes, and forced rules through collective action. It wasn't perfect. Bosses still got killed. Rules got broken. Wars still erupted when ambition overwhelmed structure. But compared to the chaos of the 1920s, compared to the Castellammarese War's carnage, the commission was revolutionary. It extended careers, increased profits, and created a criminal infrastructure that law enforcement struggled to penetrate. because it was decentralized enough to survive arrests and deaths of individual leaders. Luciano had turned the mob into a business, and business was very, very good. But here's what the Hollywood versions often miss, the thing that makes this human beneath the structural innovation. Luciano didn't create the commission because he was some genius who saw 20 moves ahead. He created it because he was tired of watching friends die in pointless wars, tired of brilliant minds wasted on territorial disputes. He'd lived through the violence, participated in it, orchestrated murders to end the war, and he understood that violence was a tool, not a way of life. The meeting wasn't 9 minutes of intimidation, it was persuasion, showing hardened killers that cooperation would make them richer than competition. Appealing to self-interest in a way that transcended ego, offering a vision more appealing than the bloody present. And the remarkable thing is that they listened. What people called legendary often began as something deeply personal. The commission lasted, through Luciano's imprisonment in 1936, through World War II, through federal prosecutions in the 1980s. The structure bent, adapted, weakened but never fully broke. Even today, nearly a century later, organized crime in America still operates with echoes of the model Luciano created. That's his real legacy, not the violence or criminal empire. It's the structure, the recognition that even illegal enterprises function better with rules and coordination. He took the chaos of the underworld and imposed order, not through force alone, but through the idea that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. The image was real, so was the silence afterward. Lucky Luciano never spoke publicly about that meeting, never wrote a memoir detailing what he said to convince those bosses to abandon centuries of tradition, never gave interviews explaining the logic behind the commission. He went to prison in 1936, was deported to Italy in 1946, and died in 1962 without ever fully documenting the moment that changed organized crime forever. What we know comes from FBI wiretaps, informant testimony, and the institutional memory of the families themselves. But the silence is revealing, because Luciano understood something that modern criminals often forget. The most powerful structures are the ones people take for granted. By never claiming credit, never explaining the blueprint, never drawing attention to the mechanics of the commission, he allowed it to become invisible. Law enforcement knew it existed but struggled to prove it in court. The families operated within its framework so naturally they forgot it had ever been revolutionary. And Luciano's role as architect faded into the mythology, less important than the structure itself. That's the mark of true institutional innovation. When the system outlives its creator and operates independently of any individual's power or presence. Many knew the legend, the gangster who killed his way to the top, the boss who created the commission, the man who modernized the mob, but very few understood the hunger that built it. The immigrant kid who watched old world traditions destroy new world opportunities. The young gangster who saw friends die in wars that benefited no one. The strategic thinker who recognized that the only way to survive long-term was to create rules that everyone followed, including himself. That hunger came from somewhere much deeper, from the knowledge that power without structure is temporary, that violence without purpose is waste, that the difference between a gang and an organization is the ability to outlast any single leader. Luciano didn't just want to be the most powerful gangster in New York. He wanted to create something that would last beyond him. And in that ambition, criminal though it was, there's something almost visionary. The real story was never only about what happened in that room in 1931. It was about what didn't happen afterward. The wars that weren't fought, the murders that weren't committed, the conflicts that were negotiated instead of escalated. The commission didn't eliminate violence from organized crime. Nothing could do that, but it channeled it, controlled it, made it a tool rather than the default response. And in doing so, it proved that even the most violent men could be convinced to follow rules if those rules served their interests. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of Luciano's legacy. The commission worked, not morally, not legally, but practically. It made organized crime more efficient, profitable, and more sustainable. It created a criminal infrastructure that survived law enforcement pressure, internal conflicts, and generational changes. It demonstrated that the principles of corporate governance, checks and balances, distributed authority, rule-based dispute resolution could work even in the illegal economy. Luciano died in 1962 at Naples airport, collapsing from a heart attack while meeting with a Hollywood producer. He was 64 years old, living in exile, still connected but far from the world he'd reshaped. His body was returned to New York and buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens. Thousands attended his funeral, and the commission, the structure he'd created 3 decades earlier, continued to function without him, because that's what institutions do. They outlive their founders. They adapt to new circumstances. They become so embedded in the culture that people forget they were ever designed by anyone. And that, perhaps more than any murder or criminal scheme, is Lucky Luciano's most lasting contribution to American organized crime. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. When you look at photographs of the original commission bosses, you see men who look like businessmen, expensive suits, calm expressions. That was intentional. Part of Luciano's vision was to make organized crime look like legitimate business. The meeting itself probably looked boring. Men sitting around a table talking, no guns, just a proposal, discussion, decision. The kind of scene in corporate boardrooms daily, except this one was built on murder. But that surface concealed something profound. Luciano was asking men who'd built identities on individual power to surrender some to a collective, to trust the system would protect them better than their guns, to believe long-term cooperation was more valuable than short-term dominance. The fact that it worked speaks to both Luciano's persuasive ability and the exhaustion the war had created. The bosses were ready for something different. When Luciano offered them a way forward that didn't require constant warfare, they took it, not because they became peaceful, but because they recognized peace was more profitable. And that is where the legend became something more human. The story of the commission is often told as a tale of criminal innovation, of the mafia's golden age, of the moment organized crime in America became truly organized. And all of that is true, but it's also a story about persuasion, about understanding what motivates people and appealing to those motivations, about recognizing when tradition has become a liability and having the courage to propose something radically different, about building consensus among people who are used to taking what they want by force. Lucky Luciano proved in that room that even the most violent men respond to logic, that self-interest, properly channeled, can create cooperation. That structure and rules, even in the criminal world, provide value that chaos cannot match. These aren't comfortable lessons. They don't fit neatly into narratives about good and evil, law and order, civilization and criminality. But they're true nonetheless. The commission created modern organized crime. And modern organized crime, for all its violence and corruption and social harm, demonstrated that illegal enterprises function according to the same economic principles as legal ones: supply and demand, risk and reward, competition and cooperation, structure and stability. Luciano didn't invent these principles. He just applied them to a world that had been operating without them. And in those 9 minutes, speaking to 7 mob bosses in a smoke-filled room somewhere in New York, he convinced them that the future belonged to organization over chaos, cooperation over conflict, and long-term thinking over short-term revenge. They listened, they agreed, they built something that lasted, and nearly a century later, we're still trying to dismantle what Lucky Luciano created in 9 minutes of conversation.